The Grandview Hotel stood like a fortress of polished marble and crystal chandeliers on Fifth Avenue, its revolving doors spinning endlessly as Manhattan's elite swept in and out of its opulent lobby. In the summer of 2007, the economic boom still painted the city in golden hues, and hotels like the Grandview thrived on the dreams and ambitions of those who could afford to stay there. But behind the gleaming facade, in the service corridors and linen closets, another world existed, one of quiet efficiency, invisible hands, and stories that were never meant to be told. Esperanza Morales had worked these halls for 3 years, her small frame moving through the shadows like a ghost. At 34, she possessed the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted, dark eyes that held depths of unspoken thoughts, hands that moved with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. To the guests, she was simply the maid who straightened their pillows and left origami towel swans on their beds. To her co-workers, she was the quiet one who spoke English with a slight accent that revealed her roots in El Salvador, though she rarely talked about the life she'd left behind. The morning of July 15th began like any other. The humid air clung to the city streets as Esperanza emerged from the subway at 59th Street, her uniform pressed and hair pulled back in the neat bun required by hotel policy. She carried with her a small leather satchel, worn at the edges but carefully maintained, that never left her side during her shifts. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, had grown accustomed to Esperanza's routine, arrive 15 minutes early, check the assignment board, and begin her rounds on the 12th floor where she had worked since her promotion 6 months earlier. "Good morning, Esperanza," Mrs. Chen called from behind the housekeeping desk, not looking up from her clipboard. "You've got rooms 1205 through 1220 today. The Johnson family in 1212 is checking out, so that one needs the full treatment." Esperanza nodded the way she always did and took her cart from the storage room. The wheels squeaked slightly, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She loaded it with fresh linens, towels that smelled of lavender, and the small bottles of imported soap that cost more than she made in a day. As she pushed the cart toward the service elevator, she passed the large windows that offered a glimpse of Central Park, where early morning joggers traced paths through the green sanctuary. Room 1205 was a standard double, recently vacated by a businessman from Chicago who had left behind nothing but wrinkled sheets and the faint scent of cologne. Esperanza worked methodically, stripping the bed with movements that had become second nature. She dusted the mahogany dresser, replaced the towels in the marble bathroom, and adjusted the curtains so they hung in perfect symmetry. But today, something was different. As she worked, she hummed, a soft melody that seemed to carry memories of another place, another time. The melody drifted through the room like incense, filling the space with something that transcended the sterile luxury of the hotel. It was the kind of song that spoke of rain on tin roofs, of mothers singing children to sleep, of dreams deferred but never forgotten. If the walls could have listened, they would have understood that Esperanza was more than the sum of her duties, more than the invisible woman who ensured their comfort. In room 1212, the Johnson family had left behind the usual detritus of a family vacation. Children's toys scattered across the floor, damp towels on the bathroom tiles, and the lingering chaos of lives lived at full volume. As Esperanza began to restore order, she found herself thinking about families, about the children she might have had in another life, in another world where circumstances had been kinder. She paused at the window, looking out at the city that had become her home but never quite felt like it belonged to her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carpet, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be a guest in a place like this, to sleep between Egyptian cotton sheets, not because it was her job to change them, but because she had chosen to. If stories like this move you, you might want to subscribe. We share these hidden human truths every day. By 4 p.m., Esperanza had completed her assigned rooms and returned her cart to the storage area. Mrs. Chen was nowhere to be seen, and the housekeeping department had settled into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon. Esperanza signed out on the timesheet, the same signature she had been leaving for 3 years, neat, careful letters that formed her name with the precision of someone who understood that even the smallest details mattered. She gathered her leather satchel from her locker, checking to ensure that its contents were secure. Whatever she carried in that bag was hers alone, a piece of privacy in a life where privacy was a luxury she could rarely afford. The other housekeepers had long since stopped asking what she kept in there, understanding that some secrets were meant to be kept. The service elevator carried her down to the basement level, where the employee exit led to a narrow alley behind the hotel. As she pushed open the heavy door, the sounds of the city rushed in, car horns, distant music from an open window, the conversations of people whose lives intersected with hers in ways they would never know. Esperanza walked to the corner of 58th Street, where she usually caught the bus that would take her to her small apartment in Queens. But instead of waiting at the bus stop, she continued walking. Security cameras would later show her turning east on 58th Street, her small figure disappearing into the evening crowd. She moved with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going, though no one could have guessed what that destination might be. The last confirmed sighting of Esperanza Morales was at 4:47 p.m. on July 15, 2007, captured by a traffic camera at the intersection of Lexington Avenue and 58th Street. She was walking alone, her leather satchel clutched against her side, her face turned towards something or someone just out of the camera's view. By the time her absence was noticed 3 days later, when she failed to show up for her Monday shift, she had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. Mrs. Chen called her apartment, but there was no answer. The landlord, when contacted, said that Esperanza's rent was paid through the end of the month, but her neighbors hadn't seen her since Friday. Her small studio apartment, when finally opened by building management, revealed a life lived with careful simplicity. A few changes of clothes, some books in Spanish, a photograph of an older woman who might have been her mother. But there were no clues, no signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone or why. The police filed a missing person report, but Esperanza Morales was just another face in a city of 8 million, another immigrant whose disappearance would be noted, but not necessarily solved. She had no family in New York, no close friends who might demand answers. She existed in that invisible space between visibility and recognition, known to many but truly seen by few. The Grandview Hotel replaced her within a week, as businesses must. Life continued in those polished corridors. Guests came and went, and the memory of the quiet woman with the beautiful hands and the secret satchel began to fade like perfume in an empty room. But disappearances, like stones thrown into still water, create ripples that extend far beyond the initial impact. And sometimes those ripples travel for years before they finally reach the shore. Detective Maria Santos had seen her share of missing person cases in her 15 years with the NYPD, but something about Esperanza Morales stuck with her like a song she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the complete absence of any logical explanation, or perhaps it was the way the case seemed to exist in the margins of a city that was expert at making people disappear. When the file landed on her desk that humid July morning in 2007, Santos had no way of knowing that this particular case would haunt her long after she retired from the force. The initial report was standard. Employee fails to show up for work. Landlord concerned about unpaid rent. No family to notify. But as Santos dug deeper, she discovered a woman who had lived her life like a carefully constructed mystery. Esperanza had no social media presence, no credit cards, no driver's license. She worked, paid her rent in cash, and existed in the city's shadow economy with the expertise of someone who understood that visibility could be dangerous. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeping supervisor, met Santos in the hotel's employee break room, a windowless space that smelled of industrial coffee and the faint chemical scent of cleaning supplies. She was reliable, Mrs. Chen insisted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had supervised dozens of housekeepers over the years. Never missed a shift, never complained, never caused problems. That's why this doesn't make sense. Santos took notes in the small spiral notebook she always carried, though she already knew that the official investigation would be limited. Missing adult with no signs of foul play, no family pushing for answers, no media attention. Cases like this fell through the cracks of an overburdened system. Did she have friends among the other employees? She was friendly but private, Mrs. Chen explained. She ate lunch alone, usually in the service corridor on the 12th floor. Sometimes I'd see her writing in a notebook during her breaks. The supervisor paused as if trying to recall something important. She was different from the others. Educated, you know. Her English was perfect when she wanted it to be, but she spoke with an accent when she was comfortable, like she was choosing which version of herself to show. The other housekeepers painted a similar picture when Santos interviewed them over the following days. Esperanza was respectful, competent, and mysteriously self-contained. She had worked with Carmen Rodriguez for 2 years, sharing the afternoon shift, but even Carmen admitted she knew almost nothing about Esperanza's life outside the hotel. She talked about books sometimes, Carmen told Santos as they sat in the hotel's cafeteria during Carmen's dinner break. Good books, too. Poetry, novels by writers I'd never heard of. I asked her once where she learned to read like that, and she just smiled and said books were cheaper than college. Carmen stirred sugar into her coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic cup. I always thought she was running from something, but I figured it wasn't my business to ask what. Santos spent 3 weeks following leads that led nowhere. Esperanza's bank account contained $2,147, enough to live modestly for a month or two, but not enough to disappear permanently. Her apartment yielded no diary, no personal correspondence, no clues about her intentions. The photograph of the older woman remained unidentified, despite Santos's efforts to trace it through immigration records and Salvadoran community organizations. The most puzzling aspect of the case was how completely Esperanza had severed ties with her past. Santos contacted immigration services, but Esperanza's records were minimal. She had entered the country legally on a visitor's visa in 2003 and had presumably overstayed, joining the millions of undocumented immigrants who formed the invisible backbone of the city's service economy. There was no record of family, no previous addresses, no paper trail that might explain who she had been before she became the quiet maid at the Grandview Hotel. It's like she materialized in New York fully formed, Santos told her partner, Detective Ray Coleman, as they reviewed the case files one evening in September. No history, no connections, no digital footprint. In 2007, that took serious effort. Coleman, a veteran detective who had seen every variation of human disappearance, shrugged. Maybe she was in witness protection. Maybe she was running from an abusive husband. Maybe she just got tired of being invisible and decided to be invisible somewhere else. He closed the file with the finality of someone who had learned to accept the limitations of police work. Some people are ghosts long before they disappear. The case officially went cold in November 2007, filed away in the vast archive of unsolved mysteries that accumulate in every police department. Santos requested that it remain open, but without new leads or evidence of foul play, there was little justification for continued investigation. The NYPD had murders to solve, crimes with victims who had families demanding justice, cases that could actually be closed. But Santos kept the file on her desk for months afterward, occasionally pulling it out during quiet moments to stare at the single photograph they had of Esperanza, her employee ID picture from the hotel. In the image, Esperanza's dark eyes looked directly at the camera with an expression that seemed both present and distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the frame. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her smile professional but warm, and there was something in her face that suggested depths that would never be explored. Years passed, and Santos worked other cases, solved some mysteries, and watched others join the ranks of the unsolved. She was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant, accumulating commendations and the respect of her colleagues. But Esperanza Morales remained with her like a question that had never been properly asked, let alone answered. In 2015, when Santos was preparing for retirement, she pulled the file one last time. The photograph had faded slightly, and the paper had yellowed around the edges, but Esperanza's eyes still held that same mysterious depth. Santos had spent 8 years wondering what secrets those eyes had seen, what stories they might have told, if anyone had bothered to ask the right questions. She made copies of everything and put them in her personal files, knowing that retirement would give her the time to pursue the case in ways that active duty had never allowed. There were leads she had never followed, connections she had never made, questions she had never asked. Esperanza Morales had vanished into the anonymity of a city that specialized in swallowing people whole, but Santos had learned that disappearances were rarely permanent. Someone always remembered, someone always knew something, and sometimes, if you were patient enough, the truth had a way of surfacing when you least expected it. The hotel had long since replaced not only Esperanza, but Mrs. Chen, who had retired to spend time with her grandchildren. The room assignments had changed, the staff had turned over multiple times, and the Grandview had undergone a renovation that erased most traces of the world Esperanza had known. But buildings have memories that transcend their human occupants, and somewhere in those polished corridors, the echo of her presence remained, waiting for someone to listen carefully enough to hear it. As Santos cleaned out her desk on her last day with the NYPD, she held Esperanza's photograph one final time. "I'm not giving up on you," she whispered to the image, a promise that felt both foolish and necessary. Some cases were meant to be solved not by police work, but by time, patience, and the kind of attention that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. Rosa Martinez had been Esperanza's neighbor for exactly 11 months before the disappearance, though she would later realize how little that proximity had taught her about the woman who lived in apartment 4B. The building on Northern Boulevard in Elmhurst, Queens, was one of those anonymous brick structures that housed the city's working invisible, a place where people came to rest between shifts, to save money, to remain unnoticed while they built lives one paycheck at a time. Rosa worked double shifts at a diner in Astoria, and most mornings she would encounter Esperanza in the narrow hallway as they both left for work. Their conversations were brief but consistent. Polite inquiries about the weather, shared complaints about the building's inadequate heating, the kind of small talk that passes between neighbors who respect each other's privacy. But Rosa had noticed things, the way observant people do when they live in close quarters with strangers. Esperanza always carried that leather satchel, worn soft with age and handling. She dressed carefully, as if her appearance mattered more than mere functionality required. Her shoes were always polished, her uniforms pressed with a precision that spoke of pride rather than vanity. And she had a way of moving through the world that suggested someone who had learned to navigate spaces where she might not be welcome. She was educated, Rosa would tell Detective Santos months later, as they sat in Rosa's small kitchen while her children played in the living room. You could tell by the way she held herself, the way she chose her words. But she worked like someone who understood that survival came first, dignity second. The apartment building's thin walls meant that Rosa often heard fragments of Esperanza's life, the sound of her television tuned to the Spanish-language news, the occasional phone conversation that never seemed to last very long, the careful footsteps of someone who tried not to disturb her neighbors. But what Rosa remembered most clearly was the music that sometimes drifted through the walls late at night, not from a radio or television, but the sound of someone humming melodies that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple beauty. She hummed like someone who knew songs that weren't on the radio, Rosa explained, struggling to articulate something she had felt rather than understood. Old songs, maybe, or songs she made up herself. It was beautiful but sad, like she was singing to someone who wasn't there. When Esperanza failed to return that July weekend, Rosa was the first to notice. She had grown accustomed to the sound of Esperanza's key in the lock around 6:30 each evening, followed by the routine sounds of someone preparing a simple dinner. By Sunday night, the silence from apartment 4B had become noticeable, then concerning, then alarming enough that Rosa called the building superintendent. The super, a man named Frank who had managed the building for 12 years, was reluctant to open an apartment without concrete evidence of an emergency. But when Esperanza failed to appear for her Monday shift at the hotel, and Mrs. Chen called looking for her, Frank agreed to perform a welfare check. Rosa accompanied him, partly out of concern and partly out of the curiosity that comes when someone you see every day suddenly vanishes from your daily routine. The apartment that Frank's key revealed was a study in careful simplicity, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that possessions were luxuries that could be lost without warning. The studio apartment contained a narrow bed made with hospital corners, a small table that served as both desk and dining surface, and a single bookshelf that held more volumes than seemed possible in such a small space. The books were a mixture of Spanish poetry, English classics, and what appeared to be literary journals. Publications with names like Prairie Schooner and the Southern Review that Rosa had never heard of, but that suggested a world of words far removed from their immigrant neighborhood. "Look at these," Frank said, pulling a slim volume from the shelf. "Pablo Neruda. I had to read him in high school." He flipped through the pages, many of which were marked with careful annotations in both Spanish and English. She was studying this stuff seriously. Rosa examined the small kitchen area where everything was clean and organized with the efficiency of someone who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. The refrigerator contained the basics: milk, eggs, vegetables for simple meals, but also a bottle of wine that had never been opened, as if it were being saved for an occasion that had never arrived. But it was the desk area that revealed the most about Esperanza's interior life. Beneath a small lamp, notebook paper was stacked in neat piles, covered with handwriting that flowed across the pages in both languages. The writing was too personal to read in detail, but Rosa could see fragments, observations about the city, descriptions of people, what appeared to be drafts of poems that started in Spanish and sometimes finished in English. She was a writer, Rosa said, though she wasn't sure if she was stating a fact or asking a question. The evidence was there in the careful formation of letters, the crossed-out words and phrases, the way certain passages had been underlined or circled as if they contained particular importance. Frank found a small address book in the desk drawer, but when he opened it, most of the pages were blank. There were a few local numbers, the hotel, a doctor's office, a grocery store, but nothing that suggested family, friends, or connections beyond the basic necessities of daily life. It was as if Esperanza had consciously stripped her life down to its essential elements, carrying only what was necessary for immediate survival. The closet contained 3 uniforms from the hotel, a few casual clothes for weekends, and a single dress that was clearly special, made of dark blue silk with a cut that suggested it had been expensive when new. Rosa touched the fabric, wondering when and where Esperanza might have worn something so elegant. What occasions in her past had called for such careful beauty? No family pictures, Frank observed, though he had found the single photograph of the older woman that Detective Santos would later examine. No letters, no personal stuff. It's like she was living in a hotel room instead of a home. But Rosa understood something that Frank missed. This wasn't the apartment of someone who didn't care about home. It was the apartment of someone who carried home inside themselves, who had learned that safety came not from accumulating possessions, but from being able to leave quickly if necessary. Every choice, from the books to the single elegant dress, had been made with the precision of someone who understood that everything you owned was also something you might have to abandon. Over the following weeks, as it became clear that Esperanza wasn't coming back, Rosa found herself listening for sounds that would never come again. The building felt different without her quiet presence, as if the removal of one careful, respectful tenant had somehow disturbed the delicate balance that allowed strangers to live in proximity without conflict. The landlord eventually cleared out the apartment, donating the books to a local library and the clothes to charity. But Rosa kept one thing, a small notebook that had fallen behind the radiator, overlooked by both the police and the landlord's cleanup crew. It contained what appeared to be drafts of poems, written in a mixture of Spanish and English, the handwriting flowing across pages like water finding its way downhill. Years later, when Rosa's own children were old enough to ask questions about the neighbor who had disappeared, she would try to explain Esperanza not as a mystery, but as a reminder that everyone carried invisible stories, hidden depths that might never be revealed. The notebook remained in Rosa's drawer, a testament to the secret life of someone who had lived among them like a ghost, present but never truly seen, known but never truly understood. 15 years is long enough for a city to forget almost anything. Buildings are demolished and rebuilt, neighborhoods gentrify beyond recognition, and the people who once walked familiar streets become memories held only by those who shared their daily routines. But some disappearances leave marks that time doesn't erase, shadows that linger in the spaces where questions were never properly answered. In 2022, Maria Santos was 73 years old and had been retired from the NYPD for 7 years. She lived in a small house in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where she tended a garden that her husband had started before his death and read mystery novels that always seemed to have neater solutions than the cases she had worked during her career. But Esperanza Morales remained with her like an unfinished sentence, a story that demanded conclusion even when all reasonable hope of resolution had passed. The catalyst came, as catalysts often do, from an unexpected source. Santos's niece, Elena, was a journalism student at Columbia who needed a subject for her senior project on cold cases and immigrant communities. Over Sunday dinner in Santos's kitchen, Elena asked about the cases that had stayed with her aunt long after retirement, the ones that continued to surface in quiet moments and sleepless nights. There was this woman, Santos began, pulling the faded file from the drawer where she had kept it all these years. Esperanza Morales. Disappeared in 2007, no trace, no explanation, worked as a housekeeper at a fancy Manhattan hotel, lived alone in Queens, and vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Elena studied the employee ID photograph, noting the same mysterious depth that had caught her aunt's attention years earlier. What made this case different from the others? Santos considered the question, trying to articulate something she had felt but never fully understood. Most people who disappear leave some kind of trail: angry phone calls, debts, relationships gone wrong, some evidence of the life they were living before it fell apart. But Esperanza was like smoke. She worked, paid her rent, and existed in the spaces between other people's lives. When she vanished, it was like she took her entire story with her. Elena's project began as a standard investigation into police procedures and immigrant vulnerability, but as she delved deeper into Esperanza's case, she discovered a network of connections that her aunt had never had the resources to explore fully. Social media had transformed the landscape of human connection, and tools that hadn't existed in 2007 now offered possibilities for tracking down fragments of forgotten lives. The breakthrough came through Carmen Rodriguez, Esperanza's former co-worker at the Grandview Hotel. Elena found Carmen through LinkedIn, where she was listed as a supervisor at a different hotel chain, having worked her way up through the hospitality industry over the past 15 years. Carmen agreed to meet at a coffee shop near her current workplace, curious about why someone would still be asking questions about a woman who had disappeared so long ago. "I've thought about her over the years," Carmen admitted as she stirred cream into her coffee. "Especially when I got promoted to management. I kept wondering what would have happened if someone had paid more attention, if we had asked the right questions while there was still time to ask them." Carmen's memory had sharpened with time, the way memories sometimes do when they carry emotional weight. She remembered details that she hadn't thought to mention to Detective Santos 15 years earlier. The way Esperanza would sometimes receive phone calls during her breaks, conversations conducted in rapid Spanish that seemed urgent but not alarmed. She remembered the books that Esperanza carried in her leather satchel, volumes of poetry that she would read during lunch breaks as if they contained messages meant specifically for her. "She showed me a poem once," Carmen said, closing her eyes as if trying to retrieve the exact words. "It was in a literary magazine, one of those small publications that nobody reads. She was so excited about it, like she had discovered treasure. I didn't understand why at the time, but now I wonder if there was something personal about her interest in that kind of writing." Elena spent the next month tracking down copies of the literary magazines that Carmen remembered seeing in Esperanza's possession. The archives of small literary journals are notoriously difficult to navigate, scattered across university libraries and personal collections, often existing only in physical form with no digital backup. But Elena's generation had grown up with search engines and social networks, and she approached the task with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the internet was both infinitely vast and surprisingly small. The discovery came at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November, as Elena worked through her fourth consecutive hour of searching online poetry databases. She had learned to recognize Esperanza's themes: immigration, displacement, the weight of invisible labor, the beauty found in mundane moments. The poems, published under various names in small journals between 2004 and 2007, shared certain characteristics: a bilingual sensibility, observations of hotel life from the perspective of service staff, and a voice that spoke of secrets carried across borders. But it was the name E. Montoya that finally caught her attention, appearing in the contributors section of Quarterly West in the spring of 2006. The poem was titled "Instructions for Disappearing" and described the art of becoming invisible in plain sight, of moving through spaces where your presence was necessary, but your personhood was optional. The voice was unmistakably the same as the fragments Elena had found in the notebooks that Rosa Martinez had preserved. Elena called her aunt at 7 the next morning, her voice breathless with discovery. "I found her," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't quite accurate. She had found evidence of Esperanza's hidden life, proof that the quiet woman who cleaned hotel rooms had been simultaneously living a secret existence as a published poet. But the woman herself remained as elusive as ever. Santos met her niece at the Columbia Library that afternoon, where Elena had assembled copies of 7 different literary magazines containing poems published under variations of Esperanza's name between 2004 and 2007. The poems told the story of someone caught between worlds, a person with an advanced education working in menial jobs, an artist whose creative life existed entirely separate from her daily survival, a woman who understood that invisibility could be both protection and prison. "Look at this one," Eleanor said, pointing to a poem published in the Southern Review in late 2006. It's about a hotel maid who discovers that one of the guests is reading her favorite poet. She wants to say something, to make a connection, but she realizes that her uniform makes her disappear. The guest sees the service, not the person providing it. Santos read the poem twice, recognizing in it the voice of someone who had lived the experiences being described. The technical skill was evident, but more than that, there was an authenticity that could only come from lived experience. Esperanza hadn't just been a maid who wrote poetry as a hobby. She had been a poet who worked as a maid, someone whose creative life existed in the margins of a survival-focused existence. She was hiding in plain sight, Santos said, understanding finally why Esperanza had been so difficult to investigate 15 years earlier. She had been living 2 lives simultaneously, the visible life of an immigrant service worker and the invisible life of a serious artist. The leather satchel had probably contained not just personal belongings, but manuscripts, correspondence with editors, the tools of a literary life that she couldn't afford to reveal. Elena's discovery transformed the case from a simple missing person investigation into something more complex. The story of someone who had learned to exist in the spaces between visibility and recognition, someone whose disappearance might have been less about running away and more about choosing which version of herself would survive. The poems painted a picture of someone who understood that her safety depended on remaining unnoticed, but whose artistic soul demanded expression even at the risk of exposure. As Santos and Elena left the library that evening, they carried with them not answers, but better questions. Esperanza Morales had been a published poet whose work had appeared in respected literary journals, someone whose artistic voice had found outlets even while her daily life remained constrained by economic necessity and immigration status. But knowing this didn't explain where she had gone or why she had chosen to disappear so completely. "We're closer than we've ever been," Elena said as they walked through the campus in the gathering dusk. "But I feel like we've just discovered that the mystery is bigger than we thought." Santos nodded, thinking about the 15 years she had carried Esperanza's photograph in her personal files, never suspecting that the woman with the mysterious eyes had been living a double life that was both more complex and more vulnerable than she had ever imagined. The poems were clues, but they were also works of art, and art had a way of revealing truth while simultaneously obscuring the facts that surrounded its creation. The Grandview Hotel in 2022 bore little resemblance to the establishment where Esperanza Morales had once moved through corridors like a careful ghost. A complete renovation in 2015 had transformed the interior into something sleeker, more contemporary, with touchscreen check-in kiosks and hallways lined with digital art displays. The marble floors remained, but everything else had been updated to meet the expectations of a generation that valued efficiency over the old-world elegance that had once defined luxury hospitality. Elena Santos Rodriguez had arranged to meet with James Morrison, the hotel's current general manager, under the pretense of researching an article about the hospitality industry's evolution over the past 2 decades. She hadn't mentioned Esperanza specifically, understanding that most businesses preferred not to discuss the disappearances of former employees, especially when those disappearances remained unsolved mysteries. Morrison was a man in his 50s who had worked in hotel management for 25 years, though he had only been at the Grandview since 2018. He led Elena through the lobby, pointing out features that had been preserved from the original design, while explaining the technological improvements that had modernized the guest experience. His pride in the hotel's reputation was evident, but Elena sensed that he was also someone who understood that buildings accumulated stories, not all of which were suitable for promotional materials. "The service corridors are mostly unchanged," Morrison explained as they took the elevator to the 12th floor. "The renovation focused on guest areas, but the back-of-house infrastructure has been solid since the building was constructed in 1987. We've upgraded the housekeeping equipment, of course, but the basic workflow remains the same." Elena followed him through the hallways where Esperanza had once pushed her squeaky cart, noting the subtle ways that the space revealed its history. The service elevator still bore scuff marks from decades of equipment transport, and the utility room still carried the faint scent of industrial cleaning supplies that transcended any cosmetic renovation. These were the spaces where the hotel's real work happened, invisible to guests but essential to their comfort. "I'm particularly interested in the housekeeping department," Elena said, trying to sound casual. "The invisible labor that makes luxury hospitality possible. Do you have any long-time employees who might have insights into how the industry has changed?" Morrison paused at the housekeeping station on the 12th floor, where supplies were stored and assignments distributed. "Most of our current staff has been here less than 10 years. Turnover in housekeeping is unfortunately high across the industry, but let me introduce you to Maria Santos, not related to your aunt, I assume, who's been our head of housekeeping for 8 years. She might know some of the older staff members who worked here before the renovation." The Maria Santos, who emerged from the supply closet, was a woman in her early 60s, with the efficient bearing of someone who had learned to manage complex operations with limited resources. She shook Elena's hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to being the only woman in management meetings, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had succeeded by paying attention to details that others overlooked. "You want to know about the old days?" Maria asked as she led Elena to a small office adjacent to the housekeeping station. "This place has seen everything. Celebrities, politicians, scandals that never made the papers, and staff members who worked here for decades before retiring or moving on to other opportunities." Elena had prepared carefully for this conversation, understanding that she needed to approach the subject of Esperanza obliquely. She asked about the challenges of managing a housekeeping staff, the skills required for the work, and the kinds of people who succeeded in positions that required both physical stamina and emotional resilience. "The best housekeepers are artists," Maria said, settling into her chair with the comfort of someone discussing a subject she understood deeply. "They understand that creating comfort for others requires attention to details that guests will never notice consciously, but will feel intuitively. It's about creating an environment where people can be their best selves, even if they don't realize that someone else made that possible." Elena sensed an opening and decided to take a calculated risk. "I'm also researching a specific case, a housekeeper named Esperanza Morales, who worked here until 2007 and then disappeared. My aunt was the detective who investigated the case." Maria's expression shifted, becoming more guarded but also more interested. "Esperanza Morales," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. "I wasn't working here in 2007, but I've heard that name mentioned. Let me think." She reached for a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "When I took this position, I inherited personnel files going back to 2005. The previous head of housekeeping, Mrs. Chen, kept meticulous records. Eleanor's heart rate accelerated as Maria flipped through pages of employee evaluations, schedule changes, and incident reports. The mundane bureaucracy of hotel management suddenly felt charged with possibility, each document potentially containing the clue that had eluded investigators for 15 years. "Here," Maria said, pulling out a performance evaluation dated March 2007. "Esperanza Morales, employee ID 2847. Listen to this. Exceptional attention to detail, works independently, popular with guests who specifically request her for their rooms, demonstrates initiative in anticipating guest needs, recommended for promotion to premium floor assignments." Elena studied the evaluation form, noting the careful handwriting that belonged to someone who took personnel management seriously. But it was the margin notes that caught her attention, small observations written in a different pen, as if someone had returned to the document later to add additional thoughts. "Mrs. Chen wrote these margin notes," Maria explained, noticing Elena's focus. "She had a habit of updating employee files based on informal observations. Look at this one. Employee maintains extensive personal library, often reads during breaks. Educational background appears underutilized. Consider for guest relations training if immigration status permits." The notation was a window into Esperanza's daily life at the hotel, confirmation that her co-workers had recognized something in her that transcended her job description. But more importantly, it suggested that Mrs. Chen had been paying closer attention to Esperanza than anyone had realized, possibly noticing details that hadn't made it into the original police investigation. "Is Mrs. Chen still alive?" Eleanor asked, trying to control the excitement in her voice. "Oh yes, very much so. She retired in 2010 but lives in Chinatown. I have her contact information because she occasionally consults on training programs for new staff. She has an incredible memory for the people who worked under her supervision." Maria paused, studying Eleanor's expression. "You really think this woman's disappearance is worth investigating after all these years?" Eleanor considered how much to reveal, then decided that honesty might serve her better than deception. "We've discovered that Esperanza was a published poet who had been appearing in literary magazines under variations of her name. She wasn't just a housekeeper who disappeared. She was an artist who was living a double life, hiding her education and creative work behind the uniform of invisible labor." Maria's eyes widened with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what that revelation meant. "That changes everything," she said softly. "If she was educated, if she was published, then her disappearance might not have been about vulnerability or victimization. It might have been about choice, about deciding which version of herself could survive." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours, as Maria shared insights from her 8 years of managing housekeeping staff at one of Manhattan's premier hotels. She explained the complex social dynamics of service work, the ways that education and intelligence could be both asset and liability depending on immigration status, and the delicate balance that many employees maintained between visibility and safety. "Some of our best employees are overqualified for their positions," Maria explained. "They're doctors from countries whose medical degrees aren't recognized here, teachers whose credentials don't transfer, engineers who are working to support families while they figure out how to rebuild their careers. The smart ones learn to hide their qualifications until they can find a way to use them safely." Eleanor understood that Maria was describing a version of survival that most Americans never had to consider. The necessity of making yourself smaller, less threatening, less visible in order to maintain the employment that kept you housed and fed. For someone like Esperanza, whose poetic voice revealed depths of education and artistic sensibility, The daily performance of invisibility might have been both protection and prison. "Could we contact Mrs. Chen?" Elena asked. "I think she might have observed things about Esperanza that she didn't share with the police at the time. Details that seemed irrelevant to a missing person investigation, but might be crucial to understanding who Esperanza really was." Maria reached for her phone without hesitation. Mrs. Chen loves to talk about the old days, especially with someone who appreciates the complexity of what she did. Managing housekeeping staff isn't just about clean rooms. It's about understanding human nature, recognizing when someone needs help, and knowing when to ask questions and when to respect privacy. The phone call was brief but promising. Mrs. Chen, now 81 years old, remembered Esperanza clearly and agreed to meet with Elena the following afternoon. Her voice, even filtered through the phone's speaker, carried the authority of someone who had spent decades observing human behavior and making decisions that affected people's livelihoods. As Elena prepared to leave the hotel, Maria walked her to the employee exit, the same door through which Esperanza had walked for the last time 15 years earlier. The alley behind the hotel was narrow and shadowed, the kind of space that existed between the public face of Manhattan luxury and the private reality of service work. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Maria said as they paused at the threshold. "But be prepared for the possibility that Esperanza's story might be more complicated than a simple disappearance. If she was living two lives, then maybe she found a way to choose which one would continue." Eleanor stepped into the alley, feeling the weight of 15 years of questions that might finally be approaching answers. The hotel behind her hummed with the activity of invisible labor, housekeepers, maintenance staff, kitchen workers who made luxury possible, while remaining largely unseen by those who benefited from their work. Esperanza had been one of them, but she had also been something more, someone whose artistic voice had found expression even while her daily existence required the performance of invisibility. The revelation that Esperanza had been a published poet transformed the mystery from a story about vulnerability into something more complex, a narrative about identity, choice, and the courage required to be fully yourself in a world that might punish you for that authenticity. Tomorrow's conversation with Mrs. Chen might provide the missing pieces, but Elena already understood that she was no longer investigating a simple disappearance. She was tracing the path of someone who had learned to exist in multiple worlds simultaneously, until the weight of that divided existence had demanded a resolution that only she could choose. Mrs. Leechan lived in a narrow walk-up apartment on Mott Street, where the sounds of Chinatown filtered through windows that had witnessed 8 decades of the neighborhood's evolution. At 81, she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had adapted to the requirements of a long career spent on her feet, but her mind remained sharp as a knife's edge, capable of recalling details from decades past with photographic clarity. Elena climbed 3 flights of stairs to reach Mrs. Chen's apartment, carrying a box of pastries from a nearby bakery that Maria Santos had recommended as the proper protocol for visiting her former supervisor. The gesture was more than politeness. It was recognition of the respect that Mrs. Chen had earned through 35 years of managing people, whose stories were often more complex than their job applications revealed. The apartment was small but meticulously organized, with furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than fashion, and photographs that chronicled a life lived with purpose and precision. Mrs. Chen served tea in delicate porcelain cups that seemed incongruous in the modest space, until Elena realized that they represented the same attention to detail that had made her legendary among hotel staff. "You want to know about Esperanza, Mrs. Chen said without preamble, settling into an armchair that commanded a view of both the street below and her guest's face. I have been thinking about her since Maria called yesterday. 15 years, and I still remember her like she worked for me last week. Eleanor had prepared questions, but Mrs. Chen's directness suggested that structured inquiry might be less effective than simply listening. She opened her notebook and waited, understanding that some stories needed to be told in their own rhythm, according to their own internal logic. Esperanza was different from the beginning, Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had evaluated hundreds of employees over the course of her career. Not different in a way that made her difficult to manage, but different in a way that made me pay attention. She understood things that I never had to teach her. Mrs. Chen described the interview process that had led to Esperanza's hiring in 2004, noting details that hadn't appeared in any personnel file. Esperanza had arrived precisely on time, dressed professionally despite clearly limited resources, and answered questions with a combination of deference and quiet confidence that suggested someone who understood the dynamics of power but wasn't intimidated by them. Her references were minimal, Mrs. Chen recalled, but her English was excellent when she chose to use it properly. During the interview, she slipped once and used a word that made me look at her more carefully. She said a task would be meticulous instead of careful. That's not a word you learn from television or casual conversation. Elena made notes, recognizing that Mrs. Chen was describing the same linguistic sophistication that had appeared in Esperanza's published poetry. The woman who had cleaned hotel rooms had possessed a vocabulary that revealed education far beyond what her employment history suggested, but she had been careful to conceal that advantage most of the time. I gave her a chance because she needed work, but I kept her because she understood hospitality in a way that can't be taught, Mrs. Chen continued. She knew how to read guests, how to anticipate needs, how to make people feel cared for without making them feel observed. That's a rare skill, and it usually comes from natural empathy combined with life experience. But it was Mrs. Chen's observations about Esperanza's personal habits that revealed the depth of attention she had paid to her employees' daily routine. She had noticed the leather satchel, the carefully maintained appearance, and the way Esperanza used her break times to retreat to quiet corners where she could read without interruption. I followed her once, Mrs. Chen admitted, her voice dropping as if she were confessing something she had kept secret for 15 years. Not because I suspected anything wrong, but because I was curious about what she found so absorbing during her breaks. She would go to the service corridor on the 12th floor, sit on the floor with her back against the wall, and read from books that she kept in that leather bag. Eleanor's pen stopped moving as she realized the significance of what Mrs. Chen was revealing. The supervisor had been aware of Esperanza's hidden intellectual life, had observed the daily routine that kept her artistic self alive during working hours, and had chosen to protect rather than report what she had seen. "What kind of books?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Poetry, mostly, but also novels by writers I recognized from my college courses before I started working in hotels. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, writers who wrote about people caught between worlds." Mrs. Chen paused, sipping her tea with the deliberate care of someone choosing her words carefully. I realized that Esperanza was reading these books not for entertainment but for connection, like she was looking for voices that understood something about her experience. The revelation that Mrs. Chen had observed Esperanza's reading habits added another layer to the mystery of her disappearance. It suggested that someone in authority had been aware of the complexity of Esperanza's inner life, had recognized that she was more than her job description suggested, and had made a conscious decision to protect her secret rather than exploit it. "Did you ever talk to her about the books?" Elena asked. Mrs. Chen's expression became complicated, mixing regret with something that might have been pride. Once, I found her reading a collection of poems by Juan Felipe Herrera, and I mentioned that I had heard him speak at a library event. She looked at me like I had discovered her hiding place, scared and grateful at the same time. The conversation that had followed, according to Mrs. Chen's recollection, had been brief but revealing. Esperanza had admitted that reading poetry helped her feel connected to a version of herself that her daily work life didn't allow her to express. She had been careful not to reveal the extent of her education or her own attempts at writing, but she had acknowledged that literature was essential to her emotional survival. I told her that everyone needed something that belonged entirely to them, Mrs. Chen said, something that work couldn't touch or take away. She smiled then, the first genuinely relaxed smile I had ever seen from her, and said that books were the only home she could carry with her anywhere. Elena felt the pieces of Esperanza's story beginning to coalesce into a more complete picture. The woman who had disappeared hadn't been simply an undocumented immigrant working in service industry. She had been an artist maintaining a carefully constructed double life, someone whose survival depended on remaining invisible, while her artistic soul demanded expression and recognition. Mrs. Chen, Elena said carefully, did you suspect that Esperanza might have been writing, not just reading? The older woman's pause was answer enough, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a secret that had been kept for 15 years. I saw her writing sometimes during her lunch breaks, not notes or lists, but the kind of writing that flows like water, like someone transcribing thoughts that are already fully formed. And once I saw her put pages into an envelope addressed to a literary magazine. Eleanor's heart rate accelerated as she realized the significance of what Mrs. Chen was revealing. Not only had the supervisor been aware of Esperanza's intellectual life, but she had observed the actual process of her artistic work, had seen her preparing submissions to publications, had been a witness to the hidden career that had resulted in published poems under various names. "Did you ever read any of her writing?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Chen rose from her chair and walked to a small desk near the window, returning with a manila folder that looked like it had been handled with great care over many years. "She left this behind," she said simply, placing the folder on the coffee table between them. The day she disappeared, she cleaned out her employee locker, but she forgot about the small storage area behind the time clock where some of the staff kept personal items. I found this there 3 days later, when I was helping the police search the building. Elena stared at the folder, understanding that she was looking at something that Detective Santos had never known existed, evidence that had been kept secret by someone who had chosen to protect Esperanza's privacy even after her disappearance. The folder was thin but substantial, suggesting that it contained documents rather than personal effects. "I never gave this to the police," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying both defiance and uncertainty. At the time I told myself that it was because they were treating her disappearance like she didn't matter, like she was just another immigrant who had probably run away. But the truth is, I read what was inside, and I understood that giving it to them would have violated something essential about who she was. Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands, revealing a collection of handwritten poems, typed manuscript pages, and correspondence with literary magazine editors. The poems were written in the same bilingual style she had discovered in the published works, but these were more personal, more revealing, chronicling the daily experience of someone living between identities. But it was the letters that provided the missing context she had been seeking. Correspondence with editors revealed that Esperanza had been submitting work under the name E. Montoya, for over 3 years, had developed relationships with several literary magazines, and had been invited to submit to anthologies focused on immigrant voices and working-class experiences. One letter, dated June 30th, 2007, just 2 weeks before her disappearance, contained an offer that would have changed everything. The editor of a small but prestigious press was inviting Montoya to submit a full-length manuscript for consideration, noting that her published poems had attracted attention from readers interested in authentic voices from the immigrant experience. She was being offered a book contract, Elena whispered, understanding finally why Esperanza might have felt compelled to make a choice between her hidden artistic life and her daily survival. Success as a poet would have required visibility, publicity, the kind of public recognition that someone without legal immigration status couldn't afford to risk. Mrs. Chen nodded, her eyes reflecting 15 years of wondering what might have happened if circumstances had been different. I think she reached a point where she couldn't live both lives anymore. The maid who cleaned hotel rooms and the poet who was being invited to publish a book. They couldn't exist in the same person indefinitely. Elena spent the next hour reading through Esperanza's papers, understanding with each page that she was witnessing the documentation of an impossible choice. The poems revealed someone whose artistic voice had been gaining recognition, whose work was being celebrated by people who didn't know her real name or immigration status. But the letters also revealed the limitations of that success, invitations to readings she couldn't attend, opportunities for publicity she couldn't risk, a literary career that could only exist in the shadows. As Elena prepared to leave Mrs. Chen's apartment, carrying the folder that contained Esperanza's hidden literary life, she understood that the mystery of the disappearance was becoming clearer even as it grew more complex. Esperanza hadn't vanished because she was in danger or because she was running from something threatening. She had disappeared because success in her artistic life had made her daily survival impossible, and she had been forced to choose which version of herself would continue to exist. "Do you think she's still alive?" Elena asked as Mrs. Chen walked her to the door. The older woman considered the question with the same careful attention she had once brought to managing hotel staff. "I think Esperanza was someone who understood that survival sometimes requires transformation. Whether the person who disappeared 15 years ago is still alive depends on how you define identity, how you measure the continuity of self across time and change." Elena descended the narrow stairs carrying more questions than answers, but also carrying the evidence that would finally allow her to understand not just what had happened to Esperanza Morales, but why it had been inevitable that someone living such a carefully divided existence would eventually be forced to choose which life to preserve. The renovation of the Grandview Hotel's executive offices in 2022 was supposed to be routine, a cosmetic update to modernize spaces that hadn't been touched since the 1990s. But construction projects have a way of uncovering secrets that buildings have kept hidden for decades, and it was during the demolition of a wall in what had once been the hotel manager's private office that workers made a discovery that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted Detective Maria Santos for 15 years. The wall safe was old-fashioned, built into the building's original structure, and concealed behind wood paneling that had been installed during a renovation in 1995. It was the kind of security feature that luxury hotels once used to store valuable documents and cash before electronic banking made such precautions obsolete. The construction crew assumed it would be empty, but protocol required that hotel management be notified before any secured storage was breached. James Morrison, the general manager, contacted the safe company to arrange for professional opening, expecting to find nothing more interesting than decades-old insurance documents or forgotten petty cash. But when the safe door swung open on a humid Tuesday morning in September, it revealed contents that no one could have anticipated, a leather satchel that had been carefully placed inside, as if someone had intended to retrieve it, but never returned. The satchel was the same one that Rosa Martinez had described seeing Esperanza carry every day. The worn leather bag that had accompanied her to work for 3 years and had never left her side during her shifts. Morrison recognized it immediately from the descriptions in the police file that Elena's investigation had brought to his attention, and he understood that he was looking at evidence in a 15-year-old missing person case. Inside the satchel, wrapped in plastic to protect them from humidity and time, were items that told the complete story of Esperanza's double life with heartbreaking clarity. There were manuscript copies of her published poems, correspondence with literary magazine editors, and a leather-bound journal that chronicled her daily experience of living between identities. But most significantly, there was a letter, sealed, stamped, and addressed to Detective Maria Santos at the NYPD, that had been written but never sent. Morrison contacted Elena immediately, understanding that the discovery required careful handling and that the family members of the missing woman should be notified before the media learned about the find. Elena arrived at the hotel within an hour, accompanied by her aunt, whose retirement had ended the moment she received the phone call that the case which had haunted her career might finally be resolved. The three of them sat in Morrison's office as Santos opened the sealed letter with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was reading words that had been intended for her eyes 15 years earlier. The handwriting was unmistakably Esperanza's, the same careful script that appeared in the poems and journal entries, formed with the precision of someone who chose words deliberately. "Detective Santos," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that I have made a choice that I hope you will understand even if you cannot approve of it. By the time you find this letter, I will have become someone else somewhere else, and the woman you are looking for will no longer exist in any way that your investigation could discover." Elena watched her aunt's face as she read, seeing 15 years of professional frustration transformed into something approaching understanding. The letter continued for 3 pages, written in the measured prose of someone who had been planning this moment for months, possibly years. Esperanza explained that the success of her poetry had created an impossible situation. Literary magazines were interested in featuring her work more prominently, editors were suggesting readings and publicity opportunities, and the possibility of a book contract had become real enough to terrify her. Recognition as a poet would require visibility that someone without legal immigration status couldn't afford, but continuing to work as a hotel maid while hiding her artistic success had become emotionally unsustainable. "I cannot be both people anymore," she wrote. "The maid who is invisible by necessity and the poet who needs to be seen to survive as an artist. One of them has to disappear, and I have chosen to save the one who can live freely, even if it means abandoning the safety that invisibility provided." The letter revealed that Esperanza had been planning her disappearance for months, saving money, establishing connections with immigrant support networks that could help her relocate and establish a new identity. She had chosen to leave behind everything connected to her life as Esperanza Morales. The apartment, the job, the routines that had provided stability in order to preserve the part of herself that had been gaining recognition in literary circles. But it was the final paragraph of the letter that provided the emotional resolution that Santos had been seeking for 15 years. "I want you to know that my disappearance is not a tragedy or a crime. It is a choice made by someone who understood that survival sometimes requires transformation. The woman you are looking for chose to become someone else rather than allow circumstances to destroy either version of herself." I hope that someday you will understand that this was an act of courage, not desperation." Santos finished reading and set the letter down carefully, her hands shaking slightly with the weight of finally understanding what had happened to the woman whose photograph had occupied space in her personal files for so many years. Eleanor reached for the journal, recognizing that it might contain additional insights into Esperanza's decision-making process. The journal entries, dated between January and July 2007, chronicled the mounting pressure that had led to Esperanza's final choice. Literary success was bringing opportunities that required her to step into the light. But stepping into the light would expose her immigration status and potentially destroy not only her own safety, but the safety of others in her community who had helped her survive in New York. One entry dated July 10, 2007, just 5 days before her disappearance, captured the impossible nature of her situation with painful clarity. They want to interview E. Montoya for a feature about emerging immigrant voices in American poetry. They want photographs, biographical information, personal details that would make a compelling story for their readers. But E. Montoya exists only on paper, in the space between languages, in the margins where survival and art intersect. The moment she becomes visible, she dies, and probably takes Esperanza with her. The final entry, dated July 14th, was brief but definitive. "Tomorrow I become someone new." I leave this record for anyone who wonders what happened to the woman who cleaned their rooms and wrote their stories. She chose to live as an artist rather than die as a ghost. Elena looked up from the journal to find her aunt and Morrison watching her, both understanding that they were witnessing the conclusion of a mystery that had been solved not by detective work, but by the missing woman's own testimony. Esperanza hadn't been kidnapped, murdered, or trafficked. She had made a calculated decision to abandon one identity in order to preserve another, choosing artistic freedom over the safety of invisibility. "She planned this perfectly," Santos said, her voice mixing admiration with professional respect. "No body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play. She disappeared in the only way that wouldn't trigger a major investigation, by making it look like a voluntary departure by someone without strong community ties." Morrison cleared his throat, drawing their attention to a question that hadn't yet been addressed. The safe required a combination to open. Someone had to have given her access, someone who trusted her enough to share that information and who was willing to keep this secret for 15 years. Elena and Santos exchanged glances, both understanding that this revelation meant someone else had been complicit in Esperanza's disappearance, someone with management-level access who had chosen to help her rather than report her plans. The investigation had revealed not just what had happened to Esperanza, but that her transformation had been assisted by someone who had recognized the impossible nature of her situation and had chosen compassion over protocol. As they prepared to leave the hotel, carrying the satchel and its contents as evidence in a case that would never be prosecuted, Elena understood that the mystery of Esperanza Morales had been solved in the most complex way possible. They knew what had happened and why, but they would never know who she had become or where she had gone. The woman who had chosen transformation over destruction had succeeded in her goal of becoming someone else, somewhere else, living as the artist she had always been beneath the uniform of invisible labor. The discovery at the Grandview had provided answers, but it had also raised new questions about identity, survival, and the choices that people make when circumstances force them to choose between safety and authenticity. Esperanza's story was ending, but Montoya's story, wherever and however it was continuing, remained unwritten, a narrative of artistic freedom purchased at the price of everything she had been before. 5 months after the discovery at the Grandview Hotel, Elena Santos Rodriguez sat in the reading room of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress, surrounded by literary magazines dating from 2008 to 2022. Her search had evolved from investigating a disappearance to tracking the artistic legacy of someone who had chosen to become invisible in order to remain visible as a writer. The task was complex, requiring her to look for stylistic continuities, thematic connections, and the kind of linguistic fingerprints that reveal an author's identity across time and pseudonyms. The breakthrough had come through academic databases that tracked publication patterns in small literary magazines. Elena had learned to recognize the bilingual sensibility that characterized Esperanza's work, the specific way she moved between Spanish and English within single poems, and the recurring themes of transformation, displacement, and the courage required to reinvent oneself. What she discovered was a trail of publications under various names: E. Rivera, Elena Montero, Luz Esperanza. That suggested someone had continued writing and publishing, but with the careful anonymity of someone who had learned that artistic visibility required personal invisibility. The most significant discovery was a collection of poems published in Prairie Schooner in 2019 under the name L. Esperanza, a sequence titled Instructions for Becoming, that served as a direct sequel to the Instructions for Disappearing that had first revealed Esperanza's identity as a published poet. The poems chronicled the experience of someone who had abandoned one life to preserve another, who had learned to live without the comfort of continuity or the safety of a stable identity. One poem in particular, titled What I Carried, seemed to speak directly to Elena's investigation. In the leather bag, I carried everything I could not leave behind, words in 2 languages, letters from editors who knew me only as ink on paper, the weight of choosing which self would survive the crossing between lives. Elena had shown the poems to linguistic analysis experts at Columbia, who confirmed what she already suspected. The author was almost certainly the same person who had published under E. Montoya between 2004 and 2007. The voice had matured, the themes had evolved, but the fundamental characteristics of style and sensibility remained consistent across 15 years of publication. But it was Dr. Carmen Delgado, a professor of Latina literature at NYU, who provided the most significant insight into what Elena had discovered. Dr. Delgado had been studying the work of contemporary immigrant poets for 20 years, and she had been following the publications of Luz Esperanza with professional interest, recognizing the quality and authenticity of the voice without knowing anything about the person behind the pseudonym. "This is extraordinary work, Dr. Delgado told Elena during their meeting in her cramped office overlooking Washington Square Park. "L. Esperanza has been publishing consistently for over a decade, and the trajectory of the work suggests someone who has found freedom to write more openly about the immigrant experience, someone who no longer has to hide their education or their artistic sophistication." Dr. Delgado had been compiling an anthology of contemporary Latina poetry, and she had been trying for 3 years to contact L. Esperanza through literary magazine editors, hoping to include several poems in the collection and possibly to invite the author to participate in readings or academic conferences. But like E. Montoya 15 years earlier, L. Esperanza maintained complete anonymity, submitting work through intermediaries and declining all opportunities for public appearance. "The work has gotten recognition," Dr. Delgado explained, pulling out copies of prestigious literary magazines that had featured L. Esperanza's poems. The Kenyan Review, the Southern Review, Poetry Magazine, these are publications that can launch academic careers, that can lead to teaching positions and book contracts. But this author seems to have chosen artistic success without personal recognition, as if the work itself is more important than the career benefits that usually accompany this level of achievement. Elena understood that she was witnessing the successful completion of Esperanza's transformation. The woman who had disappeared in 2007 to avoid the visibility that would have destroyed her safety had managed to build a significant literary career while maintaining complete personal anonymity. She had solved the problem that had forced her to choose between identities by creating a third option: artistic recognition without personal exposure. The final piece of the puzzle came through Eleanor's aunt, who had maintained contact with several retired immigration attorneys as part of her ongoing interest in cases involving undocumented individuals. One of these attorneys, Sofia Restrepo, had been following Elena's investigation with professional interest, recognizing patterns that suggested her niece had stumbled onto something larger than a single missing person case. "What you've described sounds like someone who accessed the Underground Railroad for artists," Restrepo explained, during a dinner meeting in her Brooklyn Heights apartment. "There are networks of people, immigration lawyers, artists, academics, social workers, who help creative individuals navigate the process of establishing new identities while preserving their artistic careers. It's not common, but it's not unheard of, especially for someone whose artistic success has created immigration vulnerabilities." Restrepo described a process that could take years to complete, involving the gradual establishment of new documentation, the creation of legal pathways to residency or citizenship, and the careful management of an artistic career that exists separately from legal identity. The process required significant resources, community support, and the kind of long-term planning that Esperanza's letter had suggested she had been undertaking. "If your Esperanza had connections to this kind of network," Restrepo continued, "then she might have spent the past 15 years not just hiding, but actively building a new life with legal protections that allow her to live openly as an artist. The publications you found might represent not just continued artistic work, but evidence of successful transformation." Elena left the dinner meeting understanding that her investigation had reached its natural conclusion. She had answered the question of what had happened to Esperanza Morales. She had chosen to disappear in order to become someone else, someone who could live freely as the artist she had always been. The trail of publications under various pseudonyms suggested that the transformation had been successful, that the woman who had cleaned hotel rooms while secretly writing poetry had managed to create a life where her artistic identity could flourish without the limitations imposed by immigration status or economic vulnerability. The final chapter of Elena's investigation took the form of an article published in the New York Review of Books titled "The Invisible Artist, Immigration, Identity, and the Literature of Transformation." The piece chronicled the story of Esperanza Morales and the artistic legacy of El Esperanza, treating them as connected but separate individuals whose relationship illustrated the complex ways that artists navigate survival and recognition in contemporary America. Eleanor had chosen not to reveal the specific details of how she had connected the two identities, understanding that doing so might compromise the safety that Esperanza had worked so hard to achieve. Instead, she focused on the literary work itself, arguing that the poems published under various pseudonyms represented a significant contribution to American immigrant literature, work that deserved recognition even if the author remained anonymous. The article generated considerable interest in academic circles, leading to increased attention for L.A. Esperanza's work and renewed interest in the experiences of immigrant artists who work in the margins of literary recognition. Several universities began including the poems in courses on contemporary American poetry, and the work started appearing in anthologies focused on voices that challenged traditional definitions of American identity. Elena never attempted to contact Esperanza directly, understanding that doing so would violate the boundary that Esperanza had established when she chose disappearance over visibility. But she had accomplished something that felt more important than solving a missing person case. She had ensured that Esperanza's artistic legacy would be preserved and recognized, that the woman who had chosen transformation over destruction would be remembered not as a victim but as an artist, whose work had transcended the circumstances that had originally constrained it. On a cold December evening in 2022, Elena received a package at her apartment with no return address, containing a single volume of poetry titled Instructions for Living by Esperanza. The collection brought together 15 years of work, tracking the journey from invisibility to artistic freedom, from survival to transformation. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that Elena recognized from the hotel files, was a simple inscription. For the detective who understood that some disappearances are actually discoveries. Thank you for seeing the story that was always there. Elena understood that she had received not just a book, but a form of closure, confirmation that her investigation had honored, rather than violated the boundaries that Esperanza had established when she chose to become someone else. The woman who had vanished from the Grandview Hotel 15 years earlier had succeeded in her goal of transformation, had managed to preserve the part of herself that mattered most while building a life where her artistic voice could flourish without fear. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment reading the poems that chronicled 15 years of artistic evolution, understanding that she held in her hands evidence of one of the most successful disappearances in modern history, not because someone had evaded capture, but because someone had managed to disappear from one life while simultaneously being born into another. The poem spoke of cities where no one knew her previous name, of teaching positions at small colleges where her credentials were evaluated based on her published work rather than her immigration history, of readings where she could finally speak her own words in her own voice without fear of discovery. The final poem in the collection, titled Letter to My Former Self, seemed to address the woman who had once pushed a squeaky cart through the corridors of the Grandview Hotel. I want to tell you that the fear was worth carrying, that the leather bag full of secrets became the foundation for everything I was afraid to imagine. I want to tell you that disappearing was not about ending, but about beginning, that the woman who cleaned rooms was always the same woman who would one day stand before students reading poems about the dignity of invisible labor, the poetry hidden in perfectly made beds, the literature that lives in the space between who others think you are and who you know yourself to be. Elena closed the book and walked to her window, looking out at the city where millions of people lived lives that were more complex than their visible circumstances suggested. Somewhere in this vastness, or perhaps in another city entirely, Esperanza Morales had become someone else. A professor, perhaps, or a workshop leader, or simply a woman who could walk into a bookstore and see her own work on the shelves without fear that recognition would lead to deportation. The case that had haunted Detective Maria Santos for 15 years was finally closed, not with arrest or tragedy, but with the understanding that some mysteries are solved not by finding what was lost, but by recognizing what was gained. Esperanza's disappearance had been an act of artistic and personal courage, a choice to sacrifice the safety of invisibility in order to claim the freedom of authentic self-expression. Elena placed the book on her shelf next to her journalism textbooks and case files, understanding that it represented more than the conclusion of an investigation. It was evidence that transformation was possible, that people could recreate themselves when circumstances demanded it, and that sometimes the most successful escape was not from danger, but from limitations that had been mistaken for safety. In her final report, which would eventually be published as part of a larger study on immigration and artistic expression, Elena wrote, "The disappearance of Esperanza Morales in 2007 was not a crime to be solved, but a choice to be understood. She vanished from one life in order to appear fully in another, trading the protection of invisibility for the vulnerability of artistic authenticity." Her story reminds us that identity is not fixed, that survival sometimes requires reinvention, and that the most profound disappearances are often actually discoveries, not of where someone went, but of who they were always meant to become. The leather satchel that had once held Esperanza's secrets now sits in Elena's apartment, no longer evidence in an unsolved case, but an artifact of successful transformation. Sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet, Elena thinks about the woman who once hummed melodies in hotel corridors while dreaming of a life where her voice could be heard without fear. She understands now that Esperanza found that life, that the songs she hummed while making beds for strangers eventually became poems that would outlast the hotel where she once worked, the apartment where she once lived, and the name she once carried. The mystery of what happened to Esperanza Morales has been solved, but the story of La Esperanza continues to unfold in literary magazines, poetry readings, and classroom discussions, where her work is studied and celebrated. The woman who once existed in the margins has moved to the center of her own narrative, proving that sometimes the most successful disappearance is not about becoming invisible, but about finally allowing yourself to be seen exactly as you are. In the end, Esperanza Morales didn't disappear. She revealed herself. The maid's uniform was the disguise. The poetry was always the truth. And in a world that often forces people to choose between survival and authenticity, she found a way to have both, one carefully chosen word at a time.